Otto Henne Rhyn, Anti-Zarathustra, published in 1899. Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, which is not limited to the book bearing this title, but plays a role in all three works considered here, is a prehistoric fantasy. It merely shows how Nietzsche, who was not in the least concerned with historical research, imagined prehistory. Only an imbecile can take it at face value, for its purpose is merely to give expression to Nietzsche's hot wish that in the future a barbarian master caste would be allowed to do whatever it thought good against the oppressed people. Even the first hint of this future fantasy, in Beyond Good and Evil, is promising. Nietzsche claims that in prehistoric times the value or unworthiness of an action was derived from its consequences. The action itself came into consideration just as little as its origin. It was the retroactive power of success or failure that led people to think good or bad of an action. This period is referred to by Nietzsche as the pre-moral period, and then he continues. In the last 10 millennia, note this chronological indication. On the other hand, we have come so far as to no longer let the consequences but the origin of the action decide its value. This is the modern period which, according to Nietzsche's chronology, would have begun about 8,000 years before Christ. End quote. Henne Rhyn then goes on to ask what exactly can we know, if anything, about the morality in such a far-off time as 8,000 years or 7,000 or 6,000 years before Christ, and based on what kind of evidence. Nietzsche is not at all clear as to whom he means by these, quote, noble barbarians, end quote, who are so favorably described and not even reprimanded with a single word. In one of the passages cited, he explicitly mentions the Goths and Vandals. Immediately afterwards, he extends this term to the Germanic tribes of the migration period, which he twice refers to as the, quote, blonde beasts, and claims that the horror that their raging spread throughout Europe still has an echo in the deep, icy mistrust that the German arouses as soon as he comes to power, even now again. One page earlier, however, he also extends the so-called blonde beast to the Germanic tribes, to Homeric heroes who were probably only partially blonde, that is, from the Germanic tribes to the Homeric heroes who were only partially blonde, as well as to the nobility of the Japanese and Arabs who were never blonde. The most striking thing, however, is that he heaps all the atrocities of the migration of peoples on his fellow tribesmen, the Germanic tribesmen, whose rage was surpassed 100-fold by that of the Asiatic, by no means noble Huns, and was largely falsely attributed to them, the Germanic tribesmen. So why didn't Nietzsche name the Huns? Because it didn't suit him. Because he should have been ashamed to call these arch-plebeian, dirty, shifty-eyed Mongols noble. Because they would collapse his association of the terms barbarian and noble. Because he would have had to admit that there was much more barbarism among the commoners than among the nobles. Indeed, only among the commoners, if noble is not understood as a class characteristic, but as a soul characteristic. Because in the end it would have come down to the fact that, quote, barbarian and, quote, distinguished, far from coinciding, are rather incompatible concepts. Who then staged the earlier Christian and later Jew baiting, the Inquisition, the witch trials, and the horrors of the French Revolution? The nobles in the true sense, or the commoners, the rebel? It is easy to see that Nietzsche slanders those whom he wants to elevate as barbarians in the most shameful way. It is obvious, Nietzsche claims, that the moral value designations have everywhere been placed first on people and only derivatively and late on actions. That is not at all obvious. As far as we can trace, the designations of people, both individuals and groups, were derived from personal characteristics, namely from physical characteristics or those that denoted their place of residence or rank. Moral value designations as such of groups of people are absolutely unknown. The so-called noble kind of man, he continues, feels itself to be value determining. It has no need to allow itself to be approved of. It judges. Quote, what is harmful to me is harmful in itself. It knows itself to be that which gives honor to things in the first place. It is value creating, end quote. A pure fantasy. There is no evidence anywhere of such value creation by a noble kind of human being. All that is known is that wherever men have undergone spiritual development, they have gradually advanced from the imperfect moral concepts of estimating actions according to the benefit or harm of the individual to estimating them according to consideration of the general good. This is the only moral history. There was not a pre-moral, there is not a moral, and there will not be a post-moral period. There are only stages of civilization in which men gradually advance from lower to higher culture, and thus also from worse to better morality. At lower levels of culture, the powerful and rulers are usually just as rascals and rags as the commoners, and therefore by no means noble. At higher levels, the people considered common are often nobler than the noblest lords. A continuous series of proud and hard noble castes, such as Nietzsche invents, is a ridiculous fable that can refer to absolutely no sources and for which Nietzsche himself cites no sources because there are none. The same applies to Nietzsche's entire moral historical legend, which he serves up to his readers and which his worshippers also believe at his word, namely the legend that good originally denoted the morality of the rulers, regardless of what they did, that it described the morals of the ruled as bad, that the latter, by means of a so-called quote slave revolt in morality plucked out of thin air by Nietzsche, then declared the masters who oppressed them as quote evil and themselves as good. This whole fairy tale is absolutely worthless. Not the slightest source can be found in its favor. Nietzsche's master morality is nothing but the arbitrary summary of the assumptions and self-conceit of ruling castes, who did not set up a moral system at all, but merely sought to consolidate their rule. A so-called slave uprising in morality has never and nowhere taken place. What Nietzsche calls this is simply the penetration of the consciousness that the ruled, even slaves, are human beings like others, which did not take place at certain times and in certain places, but gradually everywhere. What Nietzsche finally calls slave morality is only a malicious caricature of the real morality that goes hand in hand with increasing culture, which is based on the conviction that good is not what is comfortable for the individual, but what is conducive to the common good, and thus, of course, also to the individual. And evil is the opposite of this, which can just as well mean bad, only in an intensified form, and may then denote more severe cases of evil, such as noble denotes higher forms of good. We would like to say that the good in this true sense should form an aristocracy based neither on birth nor the exercise of power, nor the possession of money, and the nobles, an even narrower rule of the best, which however does not oppress or exploit the lower ranking people as Nietzsche would have it, but draws them to themselves with love and kindness, and even seeks to tame and improve the real beasts of human form. Just as Nietzsche, with his atheism, only strikes the anthropomorphic God, whom only the child men pay homage to, who do not read Nietzsche, so his rage against Christianity only affects the most orthodox form of it, and even that not in everything. But there is a critical Christianity to which the future belongs and which Nietzsche cannot harm, since he does not know it at all. Nietzsche confuses the narrow ecclesiastical conception of the Middle Ages with Christianity in general. He says, in Beyond Good and Evil, quote, "From the very beginning, the Christian faith is sacrifice of all freedom, all pride, all self-assurance of the spirit, at the same time bondage and self-mockery, self-mutilation." End quote. Quite a few secular and even some ecclesiastical circles of the Middle Ages would not have agreed with this definition. The German emperors, the knights, the troubadours and mina singers, the stonemasons and other guilds of the cities, then the so-called heretics, even among the religious orders, the Benedictines and the Franciscans would have objected to these ascriptions, and rightly so. And so Nietzsche continues, fighting against the most extreme orthodox clerical direction, which does not read his works, fighting against his enlightened readers who do not need this, by giving them the name Christianity, probably in the hope of thereby making it impossible in its entirety. To this end, he also invents a separate history of religion and church history, of which no one but he has ever heard. He naturally interweaves it with his equally fictitious moral history. It is said to have been the Jews who have done most against the, quote, noble mighty masters and rulers, who have stolen the term, quote, good, from these masters and henceforth understood by it, instead of Noble, mighty, beautiful, happy, beloved of God, precisely the opposite, namely the wretched, the poor, the powerless, the lowly, and among the pious, the suffering, the deprived, the ugly, whereas they designated the former, quote, good as the evil, cruel, lustful, insatiable, godless, and declared them to be the unhappy, cursed, and damned. This is said to have marked the beginning of the alleged, quote, slave revolt in morality. Of course, Nietzsche does not mention a source for this because there is none. But there is more. With this, he asserts, Israel combined a long-prepared revenge by denying and crucifying Christ as an instrument of its revenge, so that all the world, namely all of Israel's opponents, could bite on this bait. That it should be said, actually, Israel contrived, not Israel combined. Something more insane has probably never been asserted, and the result of this alleged act of revenge, Judea rose up against Rome. Judea defeated Rome, and today 3 Jews and a Jewish woman are worshipped in Rome and almost half the world over. Christ, Peter, Paul, and Mary. Not a bad joke. So the Jews defeated Rome so that a religion would triumph that they themselves had rejected, whose founder they themselves had crucified. And which of the Jews invented this suicidal revenge, decided on it, and carried it out? Nietzsche remains silent on this. Well, and after Christianity, at the instigation of the Jews, triumphed, what happened then? Then the blonde beast was tamed, the Christian priests hunted it down, improved it, and lured it into the monastery. The German had become a sinner, he was locked in a cage, surrounded by terrifying concepts. There he lay, sickly, miserable, malicious towards himself, full of hostility towards the instincts of life, full of suspicion towards everything still strong and happy. In short, he had become a Christian. The beast had grown weak, the church ruined mankind. The novel wouldn't be bad if the poet hadn't forgotten the sequel, if he hadn't cut off the story and instead continued telling how these corrupted Germans still waged feuds as before. They had to be in vain forbidden from fighting on Sundays, they waged wars against the popes, burned churches and monasteries, drove out monks and nuns, killed bishops and inquisitors, celebrated fools' festivals and donkey festivals in churches, decorated Gothic cathedrals with obscene and anti-clerical sculptures. They indulged in drinking, brawling, dancing, and masquerades, bathed together men and women in overheated bathhouses, built and maintained brothels, even granting them privileges. That they at the same time still persecuted Jews, burned heretics and witches was also no sign of weakness and tameness.